hope you've enjoyed the conference today, and thank you for joining us for the new nonprofit panel. Today, I think we're in for a treat with the panelists that we have today. And just to give you a quick overview of what we'll be talking about, we'll be discussing metrics and how, whether or not they've been effective in changing the way nonprofits operate today. We'll also be discussing social capital markets and how funding and financing of nonprofits should evolve. And lastly, we'll be discussing scale and impact and how the approaches to scale and impact should be and how they should be going forward as well. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Melissa Berman. She is the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors and also an adjunct professor here at Columbia Business School.
I got this one. Hi, good afternoon. I realize that everybody seems to be sitting here in the dark, and I don't want to overpromise. I'm hoping that we can illuminate things for you, but I don't know if we can get enough light into the back corner of the room up there. So I hope you can stay with us and stay awake, especially because darkness after lunch has been shown in various studies of metrics to lead to one conclusion only. We are very fortunate this afternoon to have a panel of people who have not only deep expertise and experience in various dimensions of the nonprofit sector, but who have also been extremely thoughtful on the whole question of what is impact, and is that the same thing as metrics or not? So starting from my immediate right, this is Phil Buchanan, who's the president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And then to his right is Chuck Harris, who is a portfolio manager and director of capital aggregation at Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, and I'll let him explain what that means. And then Nitzan Pelman, who is the executive director of Citizen Schools here in New York, a charter school network. And I'm going to ask each person to say briefly to you a little bit about themselves and the role that they play, not so much the bio, but what they think about when they think about metrics and impact, and sort of their overall philosophy about it, before we dive into specific questions, so that you get a sense of what people's point of view is before we get going. So can I start with you, Phil?
Sure, so I'll keep this brief. I'm Phil Buchanan, I'm president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. We work with large grant-making foundations to help them assess and improve their performance and effectiveness. My view on metrics in the nonprofit sector is not so much that the concept of measuring performance is new, because it isn't. It goes back a long time. Certainly Carnegie and Rockefeller, Russell Sage cared a lot about understanding the impact of what they were doing. So sometimes I think we talk as if Bill Gates was the first one who had the idea that he might like to know the results of his philanthropy, and that's just not the case. The challenge is that it's incredibly hard to measure performance in the nonprofit sector, much harder than it is in business, because there is no universal measure, there is no analog to return on investment or profitability. Folks who try to create analogs haven't fared that well in terms of actually having practical measures that can drive learning and improvement. So my view is that measurement is crucial, that there isn't enough data-driven decision-making in life, in government, in business, or in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. It just happens to be particularly difficult in philanthropy. We work with foundations to help them assess their performance. I think also I would just observe that one of the real challenges today, and we just had a piece that we put out, it's on our website just a couple of weeks ago, is that foundations, large grant-making foundations, typically say, their CEOs will tell us, we want nonprofits to demonstrate their effectiveness, to be held to higher standards of performance. And yet, very few foundations, Edna McConnell Clark Foundation would be one of a few notable exceptions, will invest the resources in helping nonprofits to do that work. So often resource constraints, as well as the enormous challenge and complexity of measurement, get in the way, and funders need to step up if they actually want nonprofits to have better data and more chances to improve their effectiveness.
Great, thanks.
Phil, I'm delighted to hear you say that this is not a new idea, because I was thinking the same thing. And I think we make a big mistake to get too hung up on nonprofit, for-profit. You know, an enterprise or an organization sort of is an enterprise or an organization, and regardless of its tax status. And if it wants to improve, it has to somehow figure out what it's doing right and what it's doing wrong. I think most of this stuff boils down to something about that simple. I came into this work after 25 years at Goldman Sachs in the corporate finance area, and followed my personal philanthropy into what eventually into a big endowed foundation, which is kind of a bizarre career path. But I got interested in this subject because I wanted my own philanthropy to make a difference, and I, tried to enact that by actually doing significant due diligence in advance of making the larger end, at least, of the grants I was capable of making, joining the boards of directors wherever I had the time and was invited to do so that I could be there to help and see it unfold. And so all this just feels extremely natural to me. As I began to try to find the point of greatest leverage as I could see it for my own activities, I thought, and we'll come back to this I'm sure, that getting people to invest collaboratively, that is together against some common goal, was something that was going on way too little. People act in quite a siloed way often in philanthropy, whether they're individuals or foundations, and that maybe I could, put a little bit of elbow grease against that problem and help create some sort of donor syndicates to get bigger things done. And I think that could, as it develops, have the additional virtue of starting to see capital get allocated against results as opposed to against, I don't know, feel-good measures or, many of the other things that drive our giving.
I guess I'll be the person on this panel who sort of represents the people on the ground who sort of do this work every day. So I run an organization called Citizen Schools in New York. We're a national organization. And in some ways what we do is what charter schools do, we do for traditional inner city public schools. So we run mandated longer school days that run from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m., which makes us remarkably popular with kids. And then we, in that extra 3 hours of learning time, we do a lot of the things that middle and affluent income kids sort of get a chance to do almost every day. So if you think about what's happening in a middle income community at 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon, kids are practicing the SATs with a tutor or working on their homework, perhaps with a parent. They're at violin lessons, they're practicing a sport, they're at Model UN, they're at yearbook. You could call it school, you could call it extracurricular activities. The point is that kids in affluent or middle income communities are in productive learning environments for 9, 10, 11 hours a day. And kids in low income communities are in school for 6 hours a day. And if we expect to close the achievement gap and the opportunity gap, we're going to find ways to make sure that kids in low-income communities can be just as competitive as kids in other communities. The charter movement figured this out a number of years ago, and they created longer school days. And if you think about charter schools, as the goal was to create a marketplace for breaking a monopoly of a public school system and really pushing a public school system to get better. I think the charter movement very well may have done that work. We operate in schools in Harlem where the charter market is extremely saturated, and public schools are really shaking. They feel the weight of losing kids to charters, which is awesome. It's exactly what was supposed to happen. But now our district public schools are saying, but we can't possibly support kids in the way that charters do. We don't have the same resources. We don't have the same capacity. And so we really believe that we need to structurally rethink how schools can operate and play around with variables like time, talent, and then also engagement in school. And so what I mean by that is, if we're going to run longer school days, because we know that that works and that matters and it makes a difference for middle-income kids and for charter school kids, then we got to offer it to regular district public school kids too. But if we're going to play around with time, then we got to also rethink a human capital model. And lastly, everyday citizens can also play a role in helping to make learning relevant for kids. And that's a big part of what we do in this extra 3 hours, is we ask everyday citizens, like people in this room, what you're passionate about, what you're excited about. And we ask you to come in and teach that to kids over a 10-week period of time. We call it an apprenticeship. And so it could be Google engineers that are teaching kids how to design video games and really showing kids how the Pythagorean theorem is used to move a character across a video game screen, and really starting to build the relevance that kids in the inner city really need in order to commit to graduating from middle school, going on to high school, and ultimately going to college in communities that generally have a dropout rate from high school at the 50% level.
Great, thank you. And I'll just say a little something about my perspective. I've been in the field of philanthropy for about a dozen years now. And before that, I was with an organization that conducted research studies, mostly for very large corporations, the Conference Board, where it became pretty clear to me that although everyone says the nonprofit sector has no bottom line and the corporate sector has a bottom line, the nonprofit sector does have a bottom line. It's on the financial statement in the lower right-hand corner. And that decisions in the corporate sector involve way more things than the so-called bottom line or ROI or things like that. If you are involved in anything having to do with financing, venture capital, PE, et cetera, I don't want to put Chuck on the spot, but you are making decisions that have to do with some fairly intangible factors. So the myth that the corporate sector is all numbers driven and the nonprofit sector is all just fuzzy math is one that I'd like us to be able to kind of walk away from. So let's just kind of start there. And I'd like to ask the panelists, when you think about some of the kinds of performance metrics that donors are looking for, whether it's with nonprofits or social enterprises, what are the ones that you feel are most important, and what kinds of buckets would you put them in? What's useful?
Well, I mean, I think, and this may be a good point of difference of perspective, because I think that, well, there is a financial component, obviously, of assessing a nonprofit's viability, that the really difficult thing to get your arms around, which I think is much more complex than analyzing investment opportunities in the for-profit world or analyzing a company's performance, is the efficacy of what you're doing. Now, it's easier in some areas than others, but if you think about what it takes to demonstrate that nurse visitation programs work in terms of visits to at-risk pregnant moms, both before the birth of a child and then after, and studying what are the long-term effects of that kind of intervention on the life outcomes for the child, or even on the mother-child relationship. You compare the complexity of that to financial analysis, and I think it's a whole nother level of complexity and involves, in fact, some different skill sets. The cost of not knowing whether something really is effective are huge. So you think about, these are the examples that get thrown around. Something like DARE, which achieved tremendous scale without any evidence of its efficacy. Millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars wasted on a program that did not actually correlate to lower rates of drug use. Scared Straight, where hardened criminals come in, talk to high school assemblies about their life of crime, and turns out the attitude change in the people in the room was exactly the opposite of what was intended. And it actually glorified and made appealing a life of crime. Why don't we study these things before we scale them? The consequences are significant. And I would say that the irony is that we see this playing out among the very folks who wave the banner of measures. Sometimes graduates of leading business schools who tout their programs' efficacy far too early and before that can really be known. So I think that's the most important thing to know. Then you need all kinds of interim sort of indicators along the way to make adjustments. But ultimately, we got to know that we're doing things that work.
Totally agree once again, and one of the hallmarks of Edna McConnell Clark is a very, very high reliance, unusually high, some would say too high, on third-party evidence of effectiveness. But I want to acknowledge, and so I would say, like Phil, the ultimate measure is, are you causing the change? In our case, we fund programs that work with the most vulnerable adolescents and young adults in the country. And the question is, do the programs change their life trajectories and allow them to bring their families out of poverty in a kind of a permanent way? So those results, I mean, it's actually kind of simple to identify. We have 3 outcome areas we fund against: academic achievement for kids who are way behind, academic gains, avoidance of risky behaviors as a teen, most particularly getting pregnant or going to jail, and then getting a decent job that you can sustain yourself and your family with. And all those things are quite measurable. The question, as Phil is alluding to, is actually a lot of things are going on in a young person's life. Which of them are causing the outcome? And in the case that I think you're probably alluding to, Nurse-Family Partnership, which we have funded for the last 7 or 8 years, they use the techniques that drug companies use, i.e. random control trials, to set up a group of mothers getting the intervention, tracked alongside a randomly selected group of mothers who don't get the intervention, and you can, and all else being equal, you can, over time, sort of check that out. Very important to note that there's measurement for lots of different reasons at different stages of a nonprofit or a social enterprise's life cycle, and I think one of the things we've learned is not to be rigid about that and understand that for a young organization, not only can't they afford a random control trial, but it's probably not appropriate, and the first thing they need to do is build their own internal performance management system so they can satisfy themselves whether what they're doing is making a difference or not. By the way, we have funded citizen schools at Edna McConnell Clark for over 10 years to the tune of about $25 million. So if anything we do works, Nitzan can tell you what it is.
I think I'm going to play the role of a little bit of the contrarian on this one. Just because I was told that we should make this a heated debate. But I'm not going to say that outcomes don't matter.
If I don't do well in the debate, it's the altitude. just want to get that out there right now. Some of you may not have gotten
Is it also your anniversary?
Yes, and it's my anniversary.
So I'll just say, by way of background, before I opened up citizen schools in New York, I worked for the Office of Accountability at the Department of Education for Joel Klein. So I'm a firm believer in accountability. I just thought I would sort of talk a little bit about some nuances in it that I think nonprofit organizations really, really wrestle with. So a couple years ago, there was this article on the front page of the New York Times that highlighted a Head Start program. So kids that had gone to Head Start, I think through this, looked at through a randomized control study, and it looked like a lot of these early interventions that had been made seemed to have really played out well. Those kids sort of learned how to read faster. They seemed to be engaging with other kids in play activities more effectively. And we said, great, Head Start is successful. We're going to scale this at the federal level. They put in billions of dollars into it, and we funded Head Start everywhere across the country for a long time. Then those kids got to like second and third and fourth grade, and lo and behold, gosh, like those results didn't seem to play out once the kids got a little bit older. And so then there was this declaration that Head Start no longer has a lasting impact on kids' lives after a few years, and so the gains that we saw in the earlier years are now erased. And so then we started to defund Head Start programs with that piece of evidence. And then they went back and looked at those kids who seemed to have done better in Head Start 30 years later. And amazingly enough, those kids had mortgages, they had saved money, they were married at a much higher level, they were employed. They just had so many of the measures that we think about having in productive lives as everyday citizens. And so, like, what do we take away from this sort of, up and downness of outcomes and results? And I think a lot of it has to do with how do we measure these things in the short term versus how do we measure things in the long term. So, working in the education space, there's a lot of talk about tests, a lot of talk about academic achievement. And, I think that a lot of people would say these tests are unbelievably flawed. They sort of force regurgitation as opposed to critical thinking skills. They sort of force kids to memorize. There's a ton of like test prep, A versus B versus C. How do you eliminate the best answers? And that's sort of what we sort of push because we're in the era of heightened accountability. And so it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it. It just means that sometimes the things that we think are measuring great outcomes may or may not actually be doing that. And I think there's lots of debate around it. I'm certainly not saying standardized tests don't do it. I just think it's much more complex. And the KIPP data, in some ways, I'll finish on the sentence, but for those of you who follow the KIPP Charter School Network, which is arguably one of the most successful charter management companies in the country, they watched their first college class graduate last year at the rate of 22%, 23%, 26%. So, and these were kids that had hundreds of millions of dollars sort of being invested in them over a 10-year period of time, and they graduated from college with not that high of a graduation rate. Now, KIPP, the data already in year 2 is better than in year 1, and there's lots of great ways to talk about it, but there's all this data that's now coming out about other strategies around character building, like grit and perseverance, that sort of need to be taught alongside of the academic stuff. And we sort of hadn't quite understood that until the last couple of years. And so I just think the question about metrics and how we measure can sometimes incentivize the right behavior, sometimes it can incentivize the wrong behavior, and sometimes it incentivizes a lot of questions.
Yeah, and I think, the core of what everybody is saying, and then I'll turn it over to Phil, who has a point here, is the real question when you're thinking about metrics is not what is it that I can see in the activities and outcomes that I can attach a number to, because that's sort of measurement without meaning. The real question is, what problem are we trying to solve here? And how many of us believe that education is good? Does anybody want to raise their hand and take the opposite point of view? But really, when you ask people why they believe in education, most of us believe in education because it gives somebody the opportunity to fulfill their potential and to have, in many cases, if they're disadvantaged, a better life. And so what we really are looking at is what are they going to be like 30 years from now, right? And that's often a very frustrating answer to donors who want metrics, because 30 years is a long time to wait, right?
Well, and I think it also depends what you're looking for, and to your point at the beginning of what you're saying, it's what the goals are. I mean, and I have this debate with Mike Balin sometimes, who was the CEO of Edna McConnell Clark Foundation and served on our board for a number of years. I took my daughter, who was 11, a few weeks ago to a nonprofit called Horizons for Homeless Children in Massachusetts. They provide play spaces in homeless shelters and preschool environments for homeless kids. And so the question is, what is the goal? You know, and the goal doesn't necessarily have to be defined as changing life outcomes. I mean, EMCF, that's what you're looking for. Other donors might be looking for something else. I personally, you know, contribute to Horizons for Homeless Children, and I would, regardless of whether those kids have better life outcomes than homeless kids who didn't have access to those play areas and preschool environments, because I believe that they should, and it's a good, and that if what my contribution is supporting is their happiness in the moments that they're there, I'm good with that. Now, obviously, the organization hopes it's more than that, but I'm comfortable with just that. So it's dependent on the goals of the nonprofit, the goals of the donor. Totally agree with Nitzan that you can't, if you fixate on one metric, and if you fixate on one metric in a moment in time, it's very dangerous. And I think the example of test scores is a great one. We at CEP created an initiative in partnership with the Gates Foundation called Youth Truth, which is about bringing student perceptual data, rigorously collected student survey data in high schools to district leaders and funders, in part because of the concern that test scores alone as a measure are not sufficient. And also, often when you boil it down to a single measure like that, it gets gamed. And you know, we've seen the cheating scandals in Atlanta and elsewhere that have developed as a result of all of the focus being put on test scores. And of course, there's also lots of perverse effects on curriculum and teacher decisions and so on.
I wanted to say something. You said probably in an offhand kind of way that there is a bottom line for a nonprofit. Of course there is. There's a
Right.
you know, statement of activities
Exactly.
or income statement
Right.
there, just like
Right.
there is. But actually, I would argue, and my friend George Overholser argues much more persuasively than I will, that actually nonprofits need to be profitable. Otherwise, how are they going to sustain themselves over time? They're going to constantly be running deficits. One of the things we try to look at as a funder, prospective funder, is the business model of this thing actually set up in an intelligent way? And usually, if the answer to that is yes, there's actually a positive profit margin. So, you know, just that alone is a misconception, I think, that it pervades the thinking and the public debate about this thing.
That's a great transition to another area I want to talk about more broadly, which is what is sometimes referred to as the social capital market, a phrase that, you know, has continued to baffle me until I decided it sort of means how organizations that are trying to make the world better get themselves funded, right? And Chuck is talking about a classic issue that confronts a lot of nonprofits, which is that many funders say, we're only going to fund the program. We don't want to fund what in the corporate sector is called operations, but what in the nonprofit sector is, I'm sorry to say, referred to as overhead. You know, like it's all, we have expensive roofs in the nonprofit sector. Clearly anybody who's worked in a nonprofit that has support from government grants knows that the rate that government's grants pay, you know, to support your core operating costs is only a fraction of what they really are. And as a result, as the Nonprofit Finance Fund has pointed out, the more grants you get, the deeper into the hole you get, right? So in addition, you have folks in the private sector who say, I don't want my money to go to overhead. Somebody else can pay for that. I only want to pay for the real programs. And occasionally we get to say to people, okay, so the nurses will operate in the dark. I'm sure it'll be fine. But the question to the panelists is, what are some of the ways that we can do to fix that? And I want to start with Chuck and the whole capital aggregation and capital funding model that you've been involved in so productively over the last decade.
Yeah, so you probably couldn't imagine building a software company having the CEO spend 40 to 70% of his or her time out asking for small amounts of money. They do rounds of equity financing generally, and they get a business plan pulled together and go and visit with venture capitalists, and they either fund it or they don't. But if they do, you amass a fair amount of money, and it carries you for a few years. I think, you know, what we're trying to do, and others are I think, trying to do is recognize that if we want, first of all, any effective service has to be housed inside some kind of delivery mechanism, which by definition is going to have overhead and computer systems and travel and entertainment budgets and all that good stuff. So let's build the enterprise that can then sustain the delivery of this effective service. And by the way, how could you ask them to make bold plans 4 or 5 years out if they're not sure how they're going to make payroll next spring? Mm-hmm. So our basic idea is let's put our resources, and then we've taken the additional step of fundraising alongside our grants. So we might put up $5 or $10 million in the case of Citizen Schools. We've done a couple of rounds of this, and let's take our point of view out to other funders, ask them to join us and invest against the nonprofit's business plan in a holistic way. It's like, in my view, it's like buying common stock in an enterprise. Let's give them the money. If you don't like their business plan, keep moving and find the one you do like. But if you do like it, give them the wherewithal to execute on it. For us, it's a combination of advanced commitment of a sizable amount of money against their objectives, not ours, and a willingness to be there when things go wrong, as they inevitably do.
And so all the funders are agreeing to the same set of metrics, so to speak, with the same timing.
So
Is
we
that
essentially,
correct?
step one for us is if the nonprofit we're dealing with doesn't have a well-articulated business plan, we buy them one, if you will. And then once we've gone through that process, we extract from the plan the milestones of progress that we think will tell us whether we're on plan or not. Mm-hmm. And we all agree on that. Mm-hmm. We fund against that, and we ask other people to say, yeah, we agree with you, those are the right milestones. We'll invest against the same set of terms that you've created. Mm-hmm. It allows, among other things, the nonprofit to do one set of reporting every quarter that then can satisfy 15 or 20 or 30 funders. And I'm sure Nitzan could tell you the stories of creating customized performance reports for 25 or 30 different funders every quarter. It's not pretty.
Right, exactly. Okay, great. I'm going to ask just one more question here, and then I'm going to throw it open to all of you for questions, although how I'll see you in the dark is a mystery I haven't solved yet. But I'm hopeful that, that somebody else will figure that out over the next 2 or 3 minutes. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to say something briefly about how they see models of organizations that are sort of moving away from the traditional kind of nonprofit model, which is you have a source of capital from group A, and then you have a machine that does a bunch of stuff, and it delivers programs and services to a completely different group from the funders. But instead, some of the kinds of nonprofits that are really much more like enterprises in that they are earning income from the same people who they are serving, and other kinds of forms that look more like impact investing and social impact bonds. Where do you see that heading, and do you see those new areas sort of being able to effectively serve the same number of people as we are currently serving, let's say, in Feeding the Hungry in New York through the more traditional model?
Well, I'm a big believer in nonprofits that are mission-driven, and when they have a surplus, they don't call it a profit, they use the surplus to reinvest in the program. I think we will always need those organizations in that there is much that cannot be achieved while simultaneously pursuing profit. Some things can be, much cannot be. If business and markets could solve all our social problems, I don't think we'd have any social problems. I also think that there's a lot of hype about new forms. You know, earned revenue, which you mentioned, is one. You look at earned revenue, right? I mean, Goodwill is over 100 years old, had an earned revenue stream since the beginning. Hospitals, nonprofit hospitals, colleges and universities. I was curious about this because there's so much rhetoric about new revenue models. If you look at the data there has been no change in the proportion of total nonprofit revenue that is earned revenue over the last decade and a half. You look at it by sector, it's basically the same story. Why? Because there isn't a model there for many of these objectives that are being pursued, which is why they're being pursued through the nonprofit model. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about some of the new, I think experimentation is good. I think we should not lose sight of the fact that this country benefits from a strong, independent, nonprofit sector of organizations that are focused on mission and mission alone, and not on profits to shareholders.
Yeah, I mean, I operate thus far entirely in grant land. So, actually, I made my first ever impact investment personally about a year ago in an organization that had an idea for student loans that were where the repayment was tied to one's income. So if you a percentage of income, and actually this has been quite effectively executed in South America. Anyway, so I bought a $25,000 note, which was a taxable note, and 4 months later, they sent me my money back because they changed their business plan. So I still haven't learned anything about how that works. I think certain areas of endeavor, like combating global warming or climate change, lend themselves more to a for-profit sort of structure than others. And you can, presumably, we could have all kinds of highly profitable companies working in the green energy space. So I see that. I mean, that makes a ton of sense to me. I think it's a little bit harder to envision in services for disadvantaged youth, which is where I live. But I would argue, I mean, Citizen Schools revenue stream consists of increasingly payments from school districts to deliver services in the schools. Now, it's not the kids who are paying directly, but nonetheless, I think that's earned revenue.
It's a market test, though.
Tapping into federal government funding streams that are targeted to solve some of these problems, and philanthropy. So getting that blend right and being agile as the various funding streams shift over time is a piece of artwork that the best nonprofits I think do very, very well. The best example that I've heard articulated lately of that I think is responsive to your question, Melissa, was I heard Jim Anderson from Bloomberg Philanthropies describe the deal that they cut with the city of New York and Goldman Sachs to deliver services at Rikers Island. So the Bloomberg Foundation or Bloomberg Philanthropies, the idea was that the program wanted to borrow some money to build the program and deliver the services. The city didn't want to pay for the services if it wasn't creating outcomes, i.e. creating a situation where fewer young people ended up back in prison fairly quickly after they were released. Goldman Sachs was happy to lend the money, but they were only induced into doing so by a guarantee from the Bloomberg Foundation. I mean, the thought of having worked at Goldman Sachs, anybody having to subsidize their activities is laughable, but that's what happened. They had to be drawn into this deal by a downside protection from Mayor Bloomberg's wealth, essentially. But I think that's a fabulous model that I hope our foundation will engage in, using our resources to draw market-based capital into social solutions. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and ultimately you can imagine a scenario where that downside protection might not be needed anymore, but I think we will have to subsidize people to get them into the market.
Great. Nitzan, you want to add something over here?
I guess I would just say that it's true what Chuck was saying, that increasingly the marketplace can afford to pay for some stuff. So our schools, we get calls from schools probably once every 2 or 3 weeks that say, the state or the federal government is going to be funding us because we're a school that has a lot of need, and we want to spend all of our money to bring citizen schools to our building. And in some ways, that's the most incredible form of validation for us in terms of the kind of results that we're delivering for kids, but also says a lot around where schools are choosing to put their money. Obviously we serve very, very poor children, so I don't think there's any potential way that their families could pay for this. But I do think that there's also like an interesting way to think about involvement of everyday citizens in sort of the process of this that may also pay out in other dividends, like the use of time. So if a Google engineer does want to contribute to society in a powerful way, or somebody who works in an advertising company, but decides like, I don't want to be a full-time teacher, but I want to, help inspire kids and teach them something very important. I'm going to do that for 90 minutes once a week for 10 weeks. Like, I think that's also a powerful model. Like, so how do we commoditize not only money, but also time?
Right. Yeah, great, thank you. I think that there's sort of tremendous opportunity as we start to think about things not just from the very narrow perspective of let's take a nonprofit and make it act like more like a business, but to think about systems where we align the investment and the returns, and we think the way they think in the terms of social impact bonds, that if you have programs like what Citizen Schools does, what Nurse Family Partnership does, eventually if you ask the what problem are you trying to solve question, it should mean a lower burden on the state in lots of ways. And right now, we're not set up to align who gets to spend the money and who gets to save the money well. And we could start to think about that in a more systematic way. So I'm going to throw the floor open, and I will point to people in a random order based on what I'm able to see. How's that? Is that fair? Do you have a better idea? You're going to, okay, I'm going to let people who can actually see go up and call on people. How's that?
Hi. I'm over here.
Thank you.
There are many of us here today who are veteran entrepreneurs. We've had our...
Yep, more or less. Go ahead.
So we're looking at our next act, right? And we're thinking about really wanting to create a social enterprise for our next 20 years or whatever. And we're aware that we're going to need to use key indicators, financial indicators, like we've always done in our own businesses. We're also aware that we're going to need to measure, as Phil said, are we doing what we plan to do? I'm in education, everybody's in a different field. But listening to you guys today, we talk about how nonprofits also need and are having financial metrics and need to measure what they're doing. I just wonder, over time, as more and more people start social enterprises, what is the difference really going to be between the nonprofits and the social enterprises?
I'll just give a very short answer, and I don't mean this to sound cynical in any way. I think what's ultimately going to be important is what is effective. And whether it's a traditional nonprofit or a social enterprise or an impact investment or a B corporation or an L3C or some other thing that somebody else is going to identify, we're all here today because we want to solve problems. So I personally think the real question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and what does it look to us based on what we know is the most effective way to try to solve it? And then the structure of the organization follows from that.
I mean, I think that there's going to always be a fundamental difference, and I've worked in the for-profit world and I've worked in the nonprofit world, and I think that there is a question of whether you're trying to deliver a profit, and if you are, in certain areas, that's going to come into tension with doing what is best from an outcome perspective. It will. So, for example, for-profit higher education, many of the entrepreneurs in that space say they're doing tremendous social good. Most of them are not. Why? Because they are marketing to essentially seduce students with a promise that they can't keep, to take on loans that they can't pay back, and then they've got a profit margin in addition to way higher advertising costs than a nonprofit institution of higher education, and the results are disastrous. Why is it that when Consumer Reports looks at which health providers have the highest quality of care, it's nonprofits? Because they don't have to take a profit margin and pay it out. Now, I know this might sound sacrilegious at a business school, but I attended one some time ago. But the fact is, there is a tension frequently between doing what's going to generate a financial return for you or your shareholders and doing what's going to be best in terms of outcomes for people. We shouldn't be surprised by this, right? I mean, look at what's happened over the last decade where we've seen many, many examples of this. And the other thing to remember is that a crucial role of nonprofits, and Chuck mentioned the environmental area, a crucial role of nonprofits has often been as the voice to take on corporations that are hurting, for example, the environment through their use of DDT or styrofoam or whatever, and persuade the public and the government and sometimes the companies themselves that they need to change. The tension that can exist between nonprofits pursuing mission and companies is a healthy one for our free market capitalist system and for our society as a whole, in my view.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Chuck?
You know, I'm in touch with some people who built one of the highest performing charter management groups in the country who are now setting off to build an education technology enterprise. Their theory is that the pedagogical techniques that are working so well for their low-income students, through their own proliferation as a charter network, they'll never touch nearly enough kids, ever. So they want to build a technology-based way to deliver equally effective teaching techniques. And they're in the middle of trying to decide whether this should be a for-profit company or a nonprofit company. And I have to say it is not obvious which way to go. There are pros and cons. And I think if I were in their shoes, I'd be doing exactly the same analysis. You know, access to capital. Do you have some kind of a favored marketing strategy as a nonprofit because people feel sorry for you, or they know you're not going to take advantage of them? I don't know, but there are things on both sides, and I just think if I were, it's mostly about tax status and inducements, and that to me is the analysis, and it often will be very clear that this is an activity that just couldn't ever take place effectively in a for-profit envelope, and then there will be others where that won't be true. So I hope it'll be a pragmatic, case-by-case consideration of those pros and cons that will drive to the answer.
Great. Another question? Sure. Just yell at us. Go ahead.
Oh, I have to yell? Okay. Anyway, I have been enlightened.
Good.
Okay, you go.
There we go.
Thank you.
Now it's on.
Okay, so I have been listening to the panel, quite curious, because most of the time we, the entrepreneurs, try to find a model, and we're always looking for a standard model that works for somebody else, trying to apply to us. And most of the time we spend a lot of, we waste momentum in that transition and not making the community participate in our metrics, because they know better than us what is the real impact of our work. And in my experience, I have a degree from Columbia in anthropology and getting another degree in social work. And every time I go back to the community, I feel dumb, because the school don't prepare you to measure the social impact in the way they measure. Yeah. So the Ivy League metrics don't work for a low-income community, you know? So it's not about grading the community. It's about finding personal reliability. That's the concept that is missing in metrics. How you identify cultural asset, how you identify social liabilities, and how you perform personal reliability. And that's what I have been applying with my nonprofit. I'm not looking around trying to apply any Ivy League, Stanford, or Wall Street or Sesame Street model. Yeah. So, so my question, after a very long comment, it's how we find a way to bring up people from the community to understand their own metrics and how we conceptualize that, because they have the knowledge.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're missing that part. So how you foundations, hedge funds organization, and charter school can really combine that? That's my question, and I'm going to keep asking that question over and over, because it is not solved. You cannot solve community problem. And what happened with nonprofits is like we always serve people that are in disadvantage. They don't have the capacity to really measure their impact. So how we can help them to help us to say how you are being impacted by our work.
Thank you. Why don't you start on that? Because that's a great question. Often, one of the advantages of the for-profit model is that the consumer is also a customer and people care what the consumer thinks, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate your question. I think it's a really good one. So I'll use an example that happened with my staff at Citizen Schools a couple years ago. I think that the conventional wisdom in this room and probably across a certain sector of people is that going to college is the goal, right? And I know that that's increasingly more and more sort of in the debate around what the financing behind going to college might look like and whether or not that debt actually plays out to be advantageous or disadvantageous for college students. If you look at the data, it's pretty clear that college students make a lot more money in the aggregate than people who don't graduate from college, right? But at the same time, you could be somebody who grows up in a low-income community and goes to a vocational school after high school and gets trained as a plumber or as an electrician and make, $80,000 or $90,000 a year. It's a totally fine salary that no one should be, poo-pooing. And so I think, so a couple of my staff members a couple years ago really raised this as an issue and said, our students, a lot of them come from immigrant communities where they might not be documented. The idea of truly going to college and getting to college just might not be the goal that we think everyone in our society should have, even if the data plays out the way that it does. And I think what's hard about it is, I turned to my staff and sort of really embraced, the question about what is the right end goal. And I asked the room, well, how many of you want to have children one day, and how many of those children do you want to send to college? And the whole room, raised their hand and said that they want their kids to go to college, right? And I said, but then how can we expect something different for the kids that we're serving? And is that a form of soft bigotry in some ways? And I really wrestle with this too, because I don't even know the answer to that question per se, but we do have conventional wisdom around what some of the metrics are at the very least that I think probably do need a double take on.
One of the most virtuous situations that I occasionally see, to my way of thinking anyway, with nonprofits serving low-income young people is getting those people back involved in the program after they've gone through it and had a better shot. And so the organizations that are really actively engaging their alumni network and drawing them back into the communities to serve their own people. I mean, that's a way, I think, to address that even if the intervention in the first place was, dreamed up by a middle-aged white man.
Great, thanks.
Not
Okay.
a full answer, but a partial answer.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, so my question is, many of you have alluded to that it's really hard to measure outcomes. In retrospect, have you noticed patterns in organizations or programs that succeeded as opposed to the programs which failed or faded over time? And kind of a related question is, where do you see nonprofit sector going in the next 10 years or so? Where do you see the field going?
We have another 4 hours, right? Go. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm going to decline to speak to your second question because I have no idea. I'm a big skeptic of people who think they can see the future or know what the trends are. And some of them maybe can. I know that I can't. But in terms of your first question, I wasn't sure whether you were asking what are the common characteristics of those who've been successful generally or been successful at measuring, successful generally. I mean, not to be too simplistic, but I mean, I think that both foundations and nonprofits are more likely to be successful when they're clear on what they're trying to do and their goals are specific and there aren't too many of them, that they've got coherent strategies to achieve those goals, that then they have relevant performance indicators connected to their strategies that they assess along the way, allowing them to iterate their strategy. And those indicators aren't just about the end outcomes because you might be waiting 30 years on those, but are hypothesis-driven but earlier indicators. And I think those are the dimensions. It's goals, strategies, I guess there's another one, good implementation and good performance indicators along the way. I think that's generally what differentiates those organizations that can then turn around and tell a really compelling story about the difference that they've made.
Yeah, and as Chuck indicated earlier, that's the same thing that makes a good organization, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit. Okay, sir.
My question is about board of directors. We haven't talked about them at all today. What is the evolution of boards, and from both the trustee level, those funding nonprofits, but then also those organizations that need boards? I support social entrepreneurs, and one of the main questions they ask me is not about funding, I need money. It's not about how do I set things up. It's I need boards, I need board members, and I need board members with skills. And so how do you talk about communities, not New York, not LA, not Seattle, not San Francisco, but in Kansas, in North Carolina? How do you talk about the evolution of boards and gaining skills for organizations starting up?
I mean, I have a brief theory, which is that the entire way most sort of fund-seeking nonprofits are governed is kind of flawed because the board of directors are by and large the chief donors. And so you are essentially, instead of having a board meeting where you're getting advice for people who are responsible for governance, you're actually having a sales meeting with your sales force, right? And nobody tells the sales force anything but good news, right? And that's a problem for the not-for-profit sector that we have not quite figured out how to solve yet. But I think generally, we generally recommend sort of thinking about what are the skill sets and knowledge bases and competencies, including cultural competencies that you need to help you govern your organization, and then where do those people live, so to speak? Where are they?
Melissa, can I respectfully disagree?
Yeah, go right ahead.
I'll say that I've created a board here in New York that is comprised of partners at big, prestigious private equity companies in finance and NBC and Google and lots of awesome people. And working with my board is literally one of the most favorite things that I do. And I think one of my board members very early on when I started Citizen Schools told me about this other board that he sits on. And he said, my biggest critique is that the executive director pretends like it's Disneyland all the time at this organization. And I know that that's not true. So I do think that this happens, absolutely. And I really took that to heart, and I was like, well, I don't want him to think that this is Disneyland at Citizen School, so I'm going to tell him every single hard thing ever that happened in the history of the organization's growth process, of which there were many hard things and continue to be. And so, and what's really remarkable about it is that, you know, the people that have joined the board are extremely intelligent. They've all built very successful businesses on their own, and like they really want to be engaged for their intellectual capital as well as their financial capital. And so we get together and we really wrestle with hard questions, and I think that unabashed dialogue has only made them more invested and more committed to building this work, and they feel so much pride when we do experience successes because they sort of mired in the hardships with us. And I think really strong leaders do this. And I think a big part of the psychological piece that goes behind it is that you have to believe that your board isn't going to think you're a bad leader because you acknowledge failure or places for growth, but that they believe that there is potential for good things because you can talk about the hard stuff.
I think that's a great point. Thank you. I've been told that our time here is up, unfortunately. I know that we could have stayed here for many hours, and I hope that I thank you for your active participation, and hope that you find the next session interesting too. Thanks.